The storm's fury finally subsided in the early hours, leaving the bunker in an eerie, awkward silence. Outside, the world was white, a barren, frozen expanse of snow and ice glistening under the weak morning sun. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken words and the weight of revelations that had upended everything. Captain Evans stared into the smoldering remains of the fire, the flicker of embers reflected in his distant gaze. His men, huddled in their coats, avoided eye contact with the quote-unquote German soldiers across the room. No one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the enormity of their situation left them at a loss for how to begin. Captain Klaus broke the silence.
Well, it appears the storm is over.
Evans glanced up.
Seems that way.
We should probably get everybody ready to go, no?
There was no urgency in his tone. It sounded more like a suggestion than a command. Evans didn't respond immediately. He let the silence linger, turning the words over in his mind.
And where would we go? Back to our missions? Back to killing?
Klaus's jaw tightened.
Well, that's what soldiers do.
Is it? Because after these past 2 weeks, I'm not sure I know what being a soldier means anymore.
The men slowly began to stir, gathering their belongings and making feeble attempts to appear ready for whatever came next. But their movements were sluggish, as if the weight of the past 2 weeks had sapped their will to act. Sergeant Shaw, sitting against the wall with his rifle across his lap, looked over at Grice.
Funny, isn't it? 2 weeks ago, I'd have gutted you without a second thought.
Grice raised an eyebrow.
And now?
Shaw chuckled.
Well, to be quite honest, now, I think I'd miss you, but don't go around telling everyone, or I'll have to cut your balls off.
Grice allowed himself a faint smile.
You'd be bored without someone to argue with.
Shaw shot back, but there was no malice in his tone.
Don't flatter yourself. You're still an arsehole.
Grice replied, his smile widening.
And you're still insufferable.
The exchange drew a few chuckles from the others, breaking some of the tension. Even Evans and Klaus exchanged a faint glance of shared understanding. Klaus leaned against the wall near the door, arms crossed as he watched his men prepare. He glanced at Evans, who was still seated by the fire.
You know, you still haven't given them orders to leave.
Evans didn't look up.
And neither have you.
Why is it that you have not given them the order?
Evans finally met Klaus's gaze.
Because I'm not sure I can.
You're their captain. It's your duty.
Duty. That's all we've told ourselves, isn't it? It's our duty to fight, to kill, to win. But whose duty is it to stop all this madness?
Klaus didn't respond immediately. He studied Evans for a moment, then said quietly,
It's not ours to question. We're just cogs in the machine.
Maybe that's the problem. Maybe we've been cogs for so long we've forgotten what it means to be human.
Klaus sighed, running a hand through his hair.
I won't lie to you, Evans. These past 2 weeks, they've changed things. They really have. But we are still soldiers, and soldiers follow orders.
I suppose you're right. Orders are orders. I mean, we are at war.
As the men sat down to a meager breakfast, the conversation turned to their lives before the war. The initial hesitance faded as the men began to share stories, each one adding a new layer to the fragile camaraderie that had formed between them. One of Klaus's men, a quiet soldier named Wilhelm, spoke first.
I used to work in a bakery. Every morning I'd wake up before sunrise to knead the dough. My daughter used to sit on the counter and watch me, you know. She'd steal little bits of dough when she thought I wasn't looking. She's my little sunshine. She's my world.
Shaw raised an eyebrow.
Ha! Never in a million years would I have mistaken you for a baker.
And so what about you? What did you do before the war? Wait, no. Let me guess. You were a gangster. That is it. That is you all the way.
I beg your fucking pardon. I was a butcher. I was the son of a butcher. My father owned a shop in Dusseldorf, right next to the Rhine. Of course, he wanted me to take over, but I joined the army instead.
Grace chimed in.
Didn't fancy chopping meat all day? Doesn't sound like you.
Shaw shook his head.
Thought I'd see the world. Turns out the world isn't all it's cracked up to be.
The men laughed quietly, the sound strangely comforting in the cold, austere bunker. For a moment, they weren't enemies. They were just men, sharing fragments of lives they'd left behind. After breakfast, Evans and Klaus called their men together. The air was heavy with anticipation as the two captains stood before their respective groups.
Welp, the storm has cleared. Looks like it's time for us to leave.
We need to work out how we do this. Obviously, we will be going in opposite directions.
Agreed. We'll part ways. Opposite directions. At least 200 meters. Safety's on. After that, we'll pretend this never happened.
The men exchanged uneasy glances, but no one voiced any objections. The captain's decision was final. One of Klaus's men asked,
And what if we meet again?
Then we do what we must. For our countries.
Klaus hesitated before adding,
But if that day comes, remember this. Remember what we shared here.
The men nodded solemnly, understanding the unspoken truth behind the words. They had formed a bond that transcended uniforms, but the world outside the bunker didn't care about bonds. It only cared about victory. Before they left, one of the British soldiers suggested that they all have one last drink, one last smoke. He put a record onto the phonograph. With a few adjustments, he managed to get it working, and the room filled with the familiar sound of a Glenn Miller track. The men sat together one last time, passing around a bottle of bourbon they'd saved for the occasion. They ate, drank, and smoked, sharing stories and laughter as the music played. For a brief, fleeting moment, they weren't soldiers. They weren't enemies. They were simply men, united by the shared experience of survival.
Well, good luck, Captain.
Klaus took the offered hand.
And to you, Captain. Wait, what do we do with the prisoner?
Leave him tied up. He was bluffing anyway. He wouldn't dare risk venturing too far being a deserter. He'd be taking a chance running into the Wehrmacht, or worse, the Russians themselves.
With that, the two groups parted, walking in opposite directions through the snow. The world was quiet again, save for the crunch of boots on frozen ground. Evans glanced over his shoulder, watching Klaus and his men disappear into the distance. He felt a pang of regret, but he pushed it aside. Duty awaited.